They were never seen apart. Appalachian Mountains, late 1800s, in the valley of Black Hollow. People learned early that some fears did not come from the dark. They came from what stood quietly inside it. The Whitlock twins were born during a winter storm so violent that 3 roofs collapsed before sunrise. By morning, the valley midwife swore she heard 2 cries rise in perfect unison, not one louder than the other. Identical, indistinguishable, and from the beginning inseparable. They were named Ruth and Eliza Whitlock. But the valley did not use their names. They called them simply the girls. They walked together, worked together, sat together in church, shoulders touching, hands folded the same way. If Ruth blinked, Eliza blinked. If Eliza tilted her head, Ruth's followed a breath later. Some said it was coincidence. Others said it was practice, and then the livestock began to die, not slaughtered, not torn by wolves, just found, eyes open, bodies untouched, blood darkened under the jaw as if something inside had decided to stop. And every time a body was found, someone in the valley would whisper the same thing: they were seen near the fence that morning, but no one ever saw them doing anything. That was the problem. They were never seen apart, not even when the bodies were. And when the preacher's brother vanished the following spring, leaving behind no one remembered him writing, the valley began to ask a different question: were the twins responsible? Or had Black Hollow chosen them to carry the shape of its fear? Because in a place where everyone looks alike, and everyone thinks alike, 2 women who thought together might be the most dangerous thing of all. Or the easiest to blame, the valley that feared them. Black Hollow sat between 2 ridges that swallowed sunlight before evening was finished. The land was not cursed, but it was stubborn. Corn grew thin, winters lasted too long, and families buried more children than they baptized. In places like that, fear does not arrive dramatically. It accumulates. Ruth and Eliza Whitlock grew into womanhood with a kind of quiet confidence that unsettled their neighbors. They did not flirt. They did not court. They did not gossip. They observed. When spoken to, they answered politely. But their eyes held steady longer than was comfortable. Not challenging, not submissive, just measuring. The valley believed in roles. Men worked fields, women married, girls obeyed. The Whitlock twins did none of these properly. They inherited a narrow patch of land after their father died of a fever that took him in 3 days. Their mother followed within the year, a cough that never loosened. The sisters buried them side by side without tears anyone could see. That was when the whispering began. Grief in Black Hollow had rules: loud crying, covered mirrors, visitors bringing pies. The Whitlocks closed their door and did not invite anyone inside. They began keeping ledgers, small notebooks with tight, precise handwriting. Accounts of seed purchases, egg counts, weather observations, too organized, some said, too private. Then came the first livestock death. A mule belonging to Old Man Carter was found collapsed near the eastern fence. No marks, no struggle. The twins had been seen walking that direction at dawn. Coincidence? But then 2 hens from the Bishop farm died the same way. Then a calf, then another mule. Always near the outer ridge, always on mornings when the sisters had been seen walking together. The valley did not confront them. Appalachian suspicion rarely moves directly, it builds behind backs in kitchens after sermons. They don't smile right. They look at you like they know something. They don't speak unless they have to. The preacher, Reverend Daniel Hale, was among the first to attempt reason. He visited their house one afternoon, Bible in hand. He later described the visit as unsettling but not sinful. They offered him tea, sat opposite him, finished each other's sentences, not interrupting but anticipating. When he asked about the livestock deaths, they expressed sympathy. When he asked where they walked in the mornings, they answered calmly, along the ridge. For air together, he asked. They looked at him, then at each other, then back. Of course, Ruth said. We prefer it, Eliza added. The Reverend left with nothing concrete. But he did not like how coordinated they felt. That was the word he used later, coordinated. As though 2 bodies moved by one quiet agreement. Spring deepened. Then his younger brother, Thomas Hale, came to visit from a neighboring valley. Thomas was impulsive, loud, fond of cards and whiskey. He took notice of the twins almost immediately. They don't look like mountain girls, he remarked one evening. They look like they are waiting for something. Thomas began visiting their property alone, the valley noticed. And then Thomas vanished. No struggle. No note. Horse still tied outside the chapel. Search parties combed the woods, nothing. Until 3 weeks later a document surfaced, a newly written will, leaving Thomas Hale's small inheritance, a modest parcel of wooded land, to Ruth and Eliza Whitlock. The date on the document was 2 days before he disappeared. Witnessed, signed, properly sealed, the signature matched. The valley fractured. Some said Thomas had debts and ran. Some said the twins manipulated him. Some said worse. But there was no body, no proof, only pattern, and the pattern was tightening. From that day forward, Black Hollow no longer looked at the Whitlock sisters with discomfort. It looked at them with calculation. Because fear changes when money is involved, and land and inheritance. The twins did not react to the whispers. They continued walking the ridge at dawn, continued keeping their ledgers, continued sitting in church shoulder to shoulder, eyes forward, hands folded identically. And something else began to change. They stopped blinking at different times. If one blinked, the other did immediately. The valley began to watch for it, to test it, to wait for it. Because if two minds were operating as one, then the question was no longer whether they were capable of harm. The question was which one was leading. Or had the valley created something by watching them too closely? And when the next death came, not livestock, this time the fear would no longer stay behind kitchen doors. It would move into the open. Psychological tension grew heavier than accusation. Men began walking their property lines at night. Women kept children indoors. The sisters continued their morning walks, continued their ledger entries, continued blinking almost but not always in unison. Reverend Hell lost sleep. He replayed every conversation, every mirrored gesture, every precise answer. He began noticing something subtle. When Ruth spoke, Eliza watched her not casually but attentively, and when Eliza spoke, Ruth's jaw tightened slightly. Not rivalry, control. But which direction? He began to wonder something far more disturbing. What if they were not manipulating deaths? What if they were studying them? Reaction, fear. And what if the valley's escalating suspicion was part of the pattern they were observing? Because fear, when provoked carefully, spreads predictably. And predictable systems can be exploited or measured. The first human death had not proven guilt. But it had changed the structure of the valley. The twins were no longer merely odd, they were central. Every illness, every misfortune, every legal document, the valley now filtered through them. And that kind of psychological gravity changes people. Especially intelligent people. Especially identical minds. And especially in a place where isolation amplifies obsession. The next death would not be quiet, and when it came, the valley would no longer debate privately. It would confront. And when that confrontation happened, the true dynamic between Ruth and Eliza Whitlock would begin to fracture. Because one mind in two bodies can share control, but under pressure, one always emerges first, the brother who vanished. Until that autumn, every suspicion had belonged to the valley. The deaths had been external, livestock, old men, a fevered child. But disappearance changes the tone of fear. And when the disappearance becomes personal, it changes the direction of it. Ruth and Eliza Whitlock had one surviving relative, a younger brother, Isaac Whitlock. He was not identical, not precise, not quiet. He had left Black Hollow at 16, seeking work beyond the ridges. He returned 3 years later, thinner, sharper in speech, carrying himself like a man who had seen roads the valley could not imagine. Unlike his sisters, Isaac spoke easily. Too easily. He laughed at gossip, dismissed whispers, told anyone who asked that his sisters were the only people in this valley who can count past 10 without using their fingers. That did not help. When Old Man Carta died, Isaac publicly defended them. When Thomas Hale vanished, Isaac accused the Reverend of fear-driven speculation. And when Samuel Bishop succumbed to fever, Isaac openly challenged the physician's diagnosis. "You blame coincidence," he said one night at the general store, "because it's easier than admitting you don't understand something." The room fell silent. Black Hollow does not forgive those who imply it is ignorant. Isaac did not care. And that made him dangerous, not to the valley, to the structure forming around his sisters. Because for the first time someone close to them disrupted the pattern. He moved independently, spoke independently, thought independently, and that introduced instability. The first crack appeared in church. Ruth and Eliza sat as always, shoulders aligned. Isaac sat one pew behind them. When the Reverend mentioned temptation disguised as intelligence, Isaac laughed, not loudly, but enough. Ruth did not turn, Eliza did just slightly, and for the first time they did not blink. Together the delay was noticeable, tiny, but visible. The Reverend saw it, so did two women across the aisle. Something was misaligned. After the service, Isaac followed his sisters home. Witnesses saw them walking the ridge path together, 3 figures instead of 2. That night a storm rolled through the valley, sharp wind, no rain. The next morning, Isaac was gone. No note, no horse, no packed belongings. His boots remained by the door. His jacket still hung on the peg inside the Whitlock house. Ruth reported the disappearance calmly. Eliza said very little. The valley searched. Men combed the ridge, checked the ravine, followed tracks until they dissolved into stone. Nothing. No struggle, no blood, no disturbed soil, only absence, and absence invites imagination. The valley did not whisper this time. It asked directly. Reverend Hell visited again. You were last seen with him, he said. Ruth nodded. He walked ahead of us. Eliza added. He was restless. Restless how? Ruth's eyes held steady. He asked questions. About what? About fear, Eliza replied. The Reverend studied them. Did you argue? Ruth blinked. Eliza did not. The delay was longer this time. We do not argue, Ruth said. But the phrasing was strange. Not we did not, we do not, present tense. A rule. The Reverend felt something shift. What did he question? He pressed. Eliza answered first. The pattern. Ruth's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. He believed the valley was constructing it. There it was, a fracture, tiny, but real. Eliza had spoken beyond what was necessary. Ruth's eyes flickered toward her. Only for a breath. But enough. Later that week, something else surfaced. Isaac had been seen at the county office days before his disappearance, reviewing property documents. Specifically, the amended deeds transferring land to the Whitlock sisters, and one more document, a life insurance policy, taken out in Isaac's name, beneficiary Ruth Whitlock. The policy had been signed 2 months earlier, witnessed properly, legal. When confronted with it, Ruth did not deny it. Isaac travels, she said evenly. It was precaution. Eliza stood beside her, silent. The Val's fear hardened, not suspicion now. Structure. If Isaac had run, why leave his boots? If he had met violence, why no sign? If he had been manipulated, why the insurance? And if the sisters were innocent, why did Eliza begin speaking less? Observant neighbors noticed something subtle. Ruth began answering questions alone. Eliza's gaze lingered longer on her sister than on anyone else. Mirroring had shifted. It was no longer seamless, it was supervised. The Reverend returned one final time. He did not bring scripture. He brought Isaac's boot, found near the eastern fence, mud-caked along the sole, no tear, no blood, but placed deliberately as if set down. He placed it on their table. Ruth looked at it. Eliza did not. Where did you find it? Ruth asked calmly. Near your ridge, Hale replied. Silence lingered. Then Eliza spoke. Proximity, she said softly, does not equal guilt. The Reverend's heart tightened. She had repeated the phrase from months earlier. Correlation is not causation. Now proximity is not guilt. Ruth's hand moved slightly toward Eliza's on the table, not comfort, restraint. That was when the Reverend understood something darker than accusation. The twins were no longer operating in perfect unison. Something had changed after Isaac began questioning the pattern. Something had destabilized the symmetry. And in systems built on mirrored psychology, instability produces escalation. Because when one mind in two bodies begins to diverge, control must be reclaimed, or eliminated. The valley felt it too. The air shifted. Children were pulled indoors before dusk. Men avoided the eastern ridge entirely, and Ruth and Eliza Whitlock continued walking at dawn. But now there was space between them. Not much, but measurable. And in Black Hollow, measurable differences are dangerous. Because the next event would not be livestock, or fever, or disappearance. It would involve confinement. And the attic door in the Whitlock house, which had not been opened in years, would finally be noticed. And when it was, the valley would no longer ask whether fear created the pattern. It would ask which sister had and whether the other had followed. Or resisted. The locked attic. In Black Hollow, houses were simple, one main room, a small sleeping space, sometimes a loft. The Whitlock house was no different except for the attic. The attic had been sealed after their mother's death. That was the explanation given. The ladder removed, the trapdoor reinforced from above. No reason to enter. For years no one questioned it, until Isaac vanished. The first person to mention the attic publicly was not the Reverend. It was Mrs. Bishop, the same woman who had buried her son Samuel. She had delivered bread to the Whitlock house days before Isaac disappeared. She remembered something. The air was warmer, she told the storekeeper. Like heat was trapped upstairs. The storekeeper dismissed it. But the thought spread. And thoughts, once seeded, grow quickly in isolated soil. Reverend Hale returned to the Whitlock property with 2 men. Not law enforcement, there was none nearby. Just witnesses. Ruth opened the door. Eliza stood behind her. The Reverend did not enter immediately. We would like to see the attic. Ruth did not blink. There is nothing there. That is precisely why we wish to see it. Eliza's fingers tightened around the edge of the doorframe. The mirroring was gone now. Ruth stood forward. Eliza slightly behind, not equal, not aligned, controlled. The Reverend stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of dried herbs and ink. The ledgers remained on the table, open, precise, no sign of disorder. The attic trapdoor was visible in the ceiling. Reinforced, new nails, that was the first undeniable detail. The reinforcement was recent, wood lighter than the surrounding beams, fresh. Why was this replaced? Hale asked. Ruth answered smoothly. Storm damage. There was no storm, one of the men said quietly. Silence filled the room. The Reverend fetched a ladder from the Bishop farm. He positioned it beneath the trapdoor. Ruth watched. Eliza did not. Eliza's eyes were fixed on her sister, waiting. The Reverend climbed. Each step creaked loudly. The nails in the trapdoor were removed one by one. The final board lifted. A rush of stale, trapped air descended. Not decay, not rot, just confinement. He raised the lantern. The attic was not empty, it was organized. 2 organized crates lined the walls, 3 of them identical in size, locked. A small cot stood near the far corner, blanket folded neatly. A water basin beside it, a chair. And on the floor scratches, parallel, repeated. Not animal, not random, deliberate. The Reverend's heart pounded. "Bring the lantern higher," one man below called. He stepped fully into the attic. The dust was minimal, meaning it had been used recently. He knelt beside the cot, pressed the blanket, still faintly warm. Someone had occupied this space within hours. He descended slowly. Ruth remained calm. Eliza's breathing was visible now, shallow, uneven. "Who was up there?" Hale asked. "No one," Ruth replied. "Then why the cot?" "For storage." "And the basin?" "For storage." "And the scratches?" Ruth's voice tightened slightly. "Wood expands." The Reverend turned to Eliza. She hesitated, just a fraction. And that fraction was the fracture. Her eyes flicked toward the attic, then toward Ruth, then down. It was the first visible hesitation anyone in the valley had witnessed. "Did Isaac go up there?" Hale asked softly. Eliza swallowed. "He was curious," she said. Ruth's hand gripped the table behind her, not visibly violent, but firm. "He went up," Eliza continued, and he said the valley was watching. The room held its breath. "What happened next?" Hale pressed. Ruth answered before Eliza could. "He left." But Eliza shook her head. "Oh, undeniable, no," she whispered. Ruth's eyes snapped toward her, sharp, controlled. "You are confused," Ruth said quietly. The dominance was clear now, not shared, directed. Eliza stepped back. "He locked it," she said. The words fell heavy. "Who?" Hale demanded. Eliza's eyes filled not with tears, with realization. "Ruth," she said. Silence broke something inside the room. The mirroring was gone. The illusion of seamless unity shattered. Ruth did not panic, did not shout. She stood straighter. And for the first time she spoke without synchrony. "He believed the valley was constructing a pattern," she said evenly. "He believed fear was self-feeding. And so," Hale demanded, "and so I gave him one." The confession was not emotional, it was clinical. He wanted proof that the valley was irrational. Ruth continued. "So I confined him." "For how long?" one of the men asked. "Long enough to demonstrate that absence creates hysteria." Eliza stared at her sister as though seeing her for the first time. "You said it was temporary," Eliza whispered. "It was. Where is he now?" Ruth did not answer. The Reverend climbed the ladder again. This time he forced open the crates. The second contained rope. The third boots, Isaac's, and beneath them a folded page, an unsigned note. Written in Isaac's handwriting. "I was wrong. The pattern is real." The ink was smudged, forced. The Reverend descended slowly. The valley had feared the twins as a shared mind. But the attic revealed something else, not 2 minds acting as one mind orchestrating, the other complying. Until now, the physical confinement mirrored the psychological one. Ruth had contained Isaac, but she had also contained Eliza, inside a system built on coordination. Now that system had cracked. The question was no longer whether the Whitlock sisters manipulated fear. The question was whether Eliza would remain inside Ruth's structure, or finally step outside it. Because the valley was no longer whispering, it was watching. And Ruth Whitlock for the first time was alone in her control. Psychological mirroring, who led whom? The attic had revealed confinement, but it had not revealed origin. To understand Ruth Whitlock, the valley had to look backward, because domination rarely appears suddenly. It forms quietly, in childhood, in small corrections, in repeated imitation. Ruth and Eliza were born minutes apart, Ruth first, Eliza second. The midwife once told Mrs. Bishop something she had never repeated publicly. "When I handed Eliza to her mother, Ruth stopped crying. Not because she was soothed, because she was watching." From the beginning, Ruth observed, Eliza followed. As children, they did not speak in half-formed sentences like other siblings. They developed language with precision. They would sit across from each other on the cabin floor and repeat words in exact rhythm. Fence, fence, corn, corn, farther, farther. But sometimes, only sometimes, Ruth would introduce a variation. Storm. Eliza would hesitate, just a beat, then repeat storm. That hesitation was the difference, small, invisible to adults, but foundational. Their father once attempted to discipline them separately. He separated them in opposite corners of the house after a dispute with a neighbor's boy. Eliza cried. Ruth did not. Instead, Ruth began speaking softly, not loudly enough for adults to hear, but Eliza responded across the room, without seeing her. Their mother described it as comfort. The valley would later understand it differently. Synchronization creates safety, but it also creates hierarchy. As they grew older, Ruth began finishing Eliza's sentences, then correcting them. Subtly. If Eliza answered a question slightly wrong, Ruth would rephrase it gently. Never harsh, never confrontational, just improved. Over time, Eliza stopped initiating responses. She waited, watched, adjusted, and this adaptation felt like harmony. To the valley it looked mystical, to Ruth it was structure. When their father fell ill, Ruth took control of the ledgers. She tracked medicine doses, measured wood supply, calculated food reserves. Eliza assisted, always slightly behind. When their father fell ill, Ruth took control of the ledgers. She tracked medicine doses, measured wood supply, calculated food reserves. Eliza assisted, always slightly behind. When their mother's cough deepened, Ruth began isolating visitors, limiting exposure, reducing conversation, claiming illness spread through proximity. Eliza supported the decision, because it made sense, it was logical, and logic was Ruth's language. After their parents died, something solidified. Ruth no longer mirrored. She initiated, Eliza mirrored, and mirroring became obedience. But obedience did not feel like submission. It felt like shared thought. That is the danger of psychological mirroring. When one mind adapts so completely to another, the distinction dissolves. Until pressure forces separation. Isaac had been that pressure. Unlike Eliza, Isaac questioned. Unlike the valley, Isaac did not fear. He saw Ruth's structure forming. He saw patterns in livestock proximity. He saw land transfers aligning with death, and he spoke. That is when Ruth began experimenting. Not with poison, not with violence, with confinement, isolation, observation. When Isaac challenged the valley's hysteria, Ruth saw opportunity. If absence created fear, then fear could be measured. If one disappearance destabilized a town, then the reaction could be studied. The attic was not built in panic. It was modified intentionally. Ruth had reinforced it months before Isaac vanished, not to kill him, to contain him, to observe how long before the valley fractured, and Eliza believed it was temporary, because Ruth framed it as demonstration. You see, Ruth would say quietly in childhood when proving a point, watch what happens. Eliza always watched, and always agreed until the attic, until Isaac's boots, until the note forced under pressure. The crack did not begin when Isaac disappeared. It began when Eliza realized she had not chosen. She had followed, and following is easy when two minds feel like one. But when the consequences become visible, ownership becomes undeniable. After the attic was opened, the valley expected hysteria. They expected screaming, resistance. Ruth gave them none. Because Ruth still believed she was right. Fear is irrational, she told Reverend Hale calmly. You created the pattern, I only observed it. But Eliza began sleeping separately. That was new. Neighbors noticed. For the first time in their lives, the twins were not seen walking the ridge together at dawn. Ruth continued. Eliza remained inside. The mirroring had reversed. Now Ruth blinked alone, and Eliza did not follow. When Hale returned days later, he found something subtle. The ledgers had changed. Ruth's entries remained precise. Eliza's handwriting trembled, not chaotic, just independent. A line out of alignment, a date slightly miswritten, tiny rebellion. The valley's fear began shifting again. No longer twin witches. No longer shared mind. Now it saw something more disturbing. Control, one orchestrator, one participant, and participation, even passive, carries weight. The question became sharper. Was Eliza complicit, or conditioned? Had she mirrored willingly, or been shaped so completely that deviation felt like betrayal? Psychological dominance rarely involves chains, it involves certainty. And Ruth Whitlock had certainty in her logic, in her patterns, in her belief that fear was a system to be measured. But she had not accounted for one variable. Guilt, and guilt disrupts symmetry. Because guilt does not mirror, it resists. The valley now waited not for another death but for divergence. Because if Eliza stepped away fully, Ruth would lose her only stabilizing reflection. And a mind accustomed to total synchronization does not respond well to isolation. The attic had revealed physical confinement, but the greater confinement had been cognitive, and it was breaking. The final inheritance document still lay unseen in the county office. And when it surfaced, it would reveal whether Ruth had planned everything alone, or whether the valley had misunderstood the direction of control entirely. Because sometimes the leader is not the one speaking first. Sometimes the mirror learns, and then chooses. The final inheritance document. The valley believed fear lived in the house. It did not. It lived in the courthouse. Every death, every transfer, every acre, recorded, stamped, filed. When Isaac Whitlock disappeared, most of Black Hollow searched the woods. Reverend Hale searched the records. Because patents do not survive without paperwork. And Ruth Whitlock loved paperwork. The county clerk was reluctant at first. The Whitlock name had not been associated with scandal until recently. Their father's property had been modest, their mother's passing uneventful. But Hale was patient. Show me the amendments, he said, specifically after their parents' deaths. The clerk pulled 3 documents. First, original estate division. Equal split between Ruth and Eliza. Second, livestock reassignment after Samuel Bishop's death. Small purchase, legal, quiet. Third, an amendment filed 6 months after Isaac returned to the valley. Hale read it once, then again, then slowly a third time. The amendment did not remove Eliza, it repositioned her. Primary estate holder Ruth Whitlock. Secondary beneficiary upon Ruth's death Eliza Whitlock. Contingency clause if Eliza predeceased Ruth, full estate to Ruth without division. But there was more. Attached was a secondary filing signed by Isaac Whitlock, witnessed by 2 men from outside Black Hollow. Isaac had relinquished his claim to shared property in exchange for a small payment. The signature looked real, but the date was troubling. Filed 3 days before Isaac vanished. Hale felt something colder than suspicion. Intent. He traced the sequence. Isaac returns to valley. Isaac questions livestock deaths. Isaac reviews property transfers. Isaac signs away claim. Isaac disappears. Ruth consolidates estate. Eliza remains secondary. But the final document held a smaller clause, nearly hidden in its phrasing. In the event of mental incapacity of secondary beneficiary, guardianship of estate defaults to primary. Mental incapacity, that word sat heavy. Because mental instability is not difficult to allege, not in 1873. Not in a valley already whispering about twins. Hale folded the document carefully. And for the first time he wondered whether Ruth's structure extended beyond fear. Whether she had been preparing not just for inheritance, but for elimination. When he returned to the Whitlock house, Eliza answered the door alone. Ruth was in the backfield. That too was new. Hale did not enter. He handed Eliza the document. She read it slowly. Her eyes moved line by line. When she reached the clause, her breathing changed. He said it was precaution, she whispered. Isaac agreed. He trusted her, Eliza replied. That sentence held more than explanation, it held fracture, because trust implies vulnerability, and vulnerability implies leverage. Did you sign anything? Hale asked gently. Eliza shook her head. No. Did Ruth ever discuss incapacity? Eliza did not answer immediately. Then she said people are easier to manage when they are labeled. The wind shifted across the ridge. The words felt heavier than the attic, because the attic contained a body. The document contained a plan. When Ruth returned from the field, she saw Hale standing outside. She did not ask why, she simply walked forward. You found it, she said calmly. You were consolidating, Hale replied. Yes. Why include mental incapacity? Ruth did not hesitate. Protection. For whom? For the estate. And Isaac. He understood risk. And Eliza. Ruth's eyes flicked toward her sister, not sharply assessing. Eliza understands structure. The dynamic was exposed now. Not emotional, not passionate, strategic. Ruth had not killed for anger. If she had killed at all, she had built incrementally. Removed variables, consolidated control, and written safeguards. Against unpredictability, even Eliza, especially Eliza. The valley had feared the twins as equal forces. But the document suggested something else. Ruth was not protecting her sister. She was preparing to outlive her. Whether naturally or otherwise, Hale made one final observation. The amendment filing ink was darker than surrounding pages, meaning it had been written quickly, without drying fully, and Isaac's signature line bore slight hesitation, as though the pen had paused mid-stroke, perhaps under watch. That night Eliza did not sleep inside the Whitlock house. She stayed with Mrs. Bishop. First time in her life she had chosen physical distance. Ruth did not protest, she did not plead, she sat at her table, rewriting entries, adjusting columns, correcting figures, because when systems collapse Ruth responded by organizing. But this time she had miscalculated. She had accounted for livestock, for neighbors, for property lore, for inheritance timing. She had not accounted for independence. Not Isaac's, and not Eliza's. The valley sensed the shift. Fear no longer pointed outward, it pointed inward, not toward witches, toward structure. And structure leaves trails, paper does not forget. The final inheritance document did not prove murder, it proved motive, consolidation, containment, contingency. If Isaac had lived, he would have been removed legally. If Eliza faltered, she could be declared unstable. If the valley turned hostile, Ruth would remain sole proprietor. The brilliance of it was not violence, it was insulation. But insulation cracks under pressure. And now the valley was pressing. Because Eliza Whitlock had begun asking questions, not in whispers, in sentences. And when a mirror stops reflecting, the original must stand alone. Part 7 will not involve the attic, or the document, it will involve decision. Because once Eliza understood she had been written into a contingency, she had to choose, remain, or testify, and the valley would learn something far more unsettling than guilt. Sometimes the most dangerous mind is not the one who dominates. It is the one who finally steps away. Who led whom? By the time the frost came early that October, Black Hollow no longer whispered about witches. It whispered about signatures and silence. For years the valley had believed the Whitlock twins were inseparable. Two faces, one will, one intention moving through two bodies. But something subtle had changed. Ruth no longer stood half a step ahead of Eliza. Eliza no longer echoed Ruth's words, they moved separately. And for the first time in their lives they slept in different houses. It was Mrs. Bishop who first noticed it. Eliza dreams louder now, she told Reverend Hale, like someone learning to speak. Because silence can be habit, and habits break slowly. The meeting, the confrontation did not happen in the house. It happened in the church, neutral ground. Ruth agreed to attend because refusal would look like fear. Eliza agreed because avoidance would look like guilt. The entire valley gathered, not to accuse, but to watch. Reverend Hale placed 3 items on the table: the livestock purchase ledger, Isaac's inheritance amendment, and the rope from the attic. He did not speak first. He let the room breathe. Ruth Whitlock, he began finally, did you manipulate these deaths for control of property? Ruth did not flinch. No, the word was steady, controlled, unemotional. Did you isolate your brother to secure inheritance? No. Did you confine him? No. Her answers were precise, not defensive, simply declarative. Then Hale turned. Eliza Whitlock. The valley held its breath. Because for the first time the question was not about Ruth. It was about separation. Did your sister force you to remain silent? The silence stretched. Eliza's hands rested in her lap, no trembling, no mirroring. Her voice, when it came, was soft. No. A ripple moved through the church. But she did not stop. She never forced me. Ruth's eyes shifted, just slightly. She suggested. Eliza continued. She calculated, she organized, she predicted outcomes. The words were careful, accurate. Did she order Isaac confined? Eliza paused. Long enough to fracture expectation. She said he was destabilizing the structure. Murmurs. She said if he exposed inconsistencies, the valley would turn violent. Did you believe her? Eliza looked directly at Ruth, for the first time without reflection. I did. The room grew colder. Because belief implies participation. You helped her? Hale asked quietly. Yes, the word landed heavier than accusation. Because this was not dominance. This was complicity. Why? Hale asked, and here for the first time Eliza's composure thinned. Because she was right about one thing, she said. Chaos destroys women like us first. The truth sat uncomfortable in the room. Independent women in 1873 did not inherit peacefully. They were challenged, tested, doubted. Ruth had built insulation. Eliza had protected it. But you let us suck. Hale pressed. Eliza closed her eyes. We did not kill him. The phrasing mattered. He fought, she continued. He resisted confinement. He tried to leave before we could decide what to do. And then? Hale asked. And then the structure failed. No one in the church needed clarification. Confinement, resistance, fall, accident, perhaps not. Ruth spoke then finally. He would have ruined us, not shouted, stated. The valley was already unstable. The livestock deaths were natural, but hysteria was not. He would have accused. The men would have seized control. The land would have fragmented. You valued land over life? Hale asked. I valued survival, the sentence echoed, because in her mind they were synonymous. Eliza turned toward her sister slowly. You valued control. It was not an accusation. It was recognition. You wrote contingencies for me. Ruth did not deny it. Because you are emotional, she said evenly. And you are not. Eliza replied. I am structured. There it was, the fracture, not hatred, not betrayal, design philosophy. Ruth believed protection required dominance. Eliza believed protection required partnership, and somewhere between those philosophies a sect died. The final break. Did you plan to declare Eliza unstable? Hale asked Ruth. Yes, she answered, gasps, if necessary. The honesty stunned more than denial would have. It would have been temporary. Temporary guardianship becomes permanent, Hale said. Ruth did not argue, because she knew the lore. She had studied it. You miscalculated, Eliza said quietly. Ruth looked at her. How? You assumed I would always mirror you. The church felt smaller now, more intimate, more dangerous. And you assumed I needed to, Eliza continued. The truth emerged slowly. They were not one mind in 2 bodies. They were 2 survival strategies born in the same house. Their father had been volatile, their mother silent. Ruth learned to control. Eliza learned to adapt. Ruth built systems. Eliza maintained relationships. Together they were efficient. Separated they were exposed. The reckoning, there was no confession of murder. There was no rope placed around wrists. Isaac's death remained ambiguous. Livestock deaths remained suspicious but unproven. But one fact was undeniable. Ruth Whitlock had structured a future in which she alone remained. And Eliza had allowed it until she saw her own name written as a contingency. The valley did not arrest Ruth. There was insufficient proof. Instead they did something quieter. They withdrew. Business slowed. Trade ceased. Isolation reversed. Because control without community collapses. And within a year the Whitlock estate fractured anyway. Eliza moved north, sold her half legally, publicly. Ruth remained alone in the valley house, structured, organized, precise, but without reflection, without echo, without second heartbeat. And that perhaps was the harshest sentence. Final question: so who led whom? Did Ruth dominate Eliza? Yes. Did Eliza enable Ruth? Yes. Was Isaac killed intentionally? Uncertain. Was the structure intentional? Absolutely. And perhaps the Val's original fear was misplaced. They were not evil. They were adaptive. Raised in instability, they learned control was safer than vulnerability. But when control extends to confinement, survival becomes tyranny, and mirrors break. The last record of Ruth Whitlock appears in 1879, property taxes paid, livestock minimal, no new filings, no amendments, no contingencies, just one name, alone. There were no trials in Black Hollow, no headlines, no gallows, no official declaration of guilt, just paper and absence. The valley never proved the Whitlock twins were killers. They proved something far more uncomfortable. That power does not always arrive violently. Sometimes it arrives organized, structured, justified. The livestock deaths were never conclusively explained. Isaac Whitlock's fall in the attic remained an accident in county records. The inheritance amendment remained legally binding. Everything was technically defensible. And that is what made it terrifying, because the most dangerous systems do not scream. They calculate. Ruth Whitlock believed survival required insulation. She believed vulnerability invited destruction. She built contingencies. She built silence, she built control, and in doing so she built isolation. Eliza Whitlock believed loyalty meant reflection. She mirrored until the mirror became a cage, and when she finally stepped away, the structure collapsed on its own weight. No mob burned the house. No sheriff sealed the doors. The valley simply stopped participating, and without witnesses, control dissolves. The final tax record lists only one occupant, Ruth Whitlock. Livestock minimal. No secondary beneficiary, no amended wills, no mirror. Some say she lived quietly until winter took her. Some say she left before that. There is no burial record that anyone agrees on. Only one certainty remains: for years the valley feared two women as one mind, but the truth was more complex. One mind built structure, the other sustained it. And when the sustaining half chose autonomy, the illusion of inevitability shattered. So were the Appalachian twins too evil for history books? Or were they simply women who understood too early that control was the only language power respected? That question remains open, because there is no confession, only patent, and in black ledger files, patent is often more honest than testimony. If this file had remained folklore, they would still be witches. If the inheritance document had never been examined, Isaac would still be a tragic accident. If Eliza had never stepped away, Ruth would still have a mirror. But history rarely shouts, it waits, it hides inside amendments, inside signatures, inside clauses written in smaller ink. And somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains there are other documents, other amendments, other quiet recalculations disguised as necessity. The next file does not involve twins, it involves a schoolhouse, an attendance book, and 5 names marked present on a day the building was locked. If you are ready to open that ledger, I will see you in the next file. Because numbers do not lie, they accumulate. And eventually they speak.